Good afternoon everyone. Today I will be quickly introducing the cost estimation for the topologies as a basis to today's session on the financing of the meshed offshore grid. Without going into too much detail on the process of performing a cost estimation, a small introduction into promotions methodology is required. Development of offshore wind energy is growing rapidly, but the exact pace at which development will take place is dependent on numerous factors, including the economic case for offshore wind, environmental constraints and the capacity in the supply chain. To account for this uncertainty in the development of offshore wind, the promotion project has considered 3 different deployment scenarios for the North Seas for 2050. A high wind development scenario amounting to 205 gigawatts of offshore wind, a central wind development scenario which amounts to 150 gigawatts, and a low wind development scenario totaling 90 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. Each of these scenarios is developed in 5-year time steps, and this is shown in the table here. The promotion project has also developed 4 grid development concepts to describe the different ways in which the offshore transmission grid could develop out to 2050. In the business as usual concept, offshore wind farms continue to get connected radially to the grid. Power exchange between countries is facilitated by separate point-to-point interconnection. In the national distributed hubs concept, the purpose of the offshore grid is first and foremost to evacuate the generated wind power from each country's exclusive economic zone to its onshore grid. The national offshore grids may also be strategically connected to each other to facilitate interconnection capacity. The European centralized hubs concept proposes the creation of several central hubs to which several offshore wind farms are connected. Power is evacuated to shore via DC connections connecting different countries. Finally, in the European distributed hubs concept, small platform-sized hubs are introduced that spread out across the North Seas and are connected to each other via DC connections and to the nearest landing points, independent on which EEZ they are located in. Combining the scenarios and the 4 grid development concepts gives us the topologies, which is the basis of the cost estimation methodology, together with the cost data for the components. In the second step of the methodology, the topologies are broken down into their main components and a study is performed on the appropriate protection system designed for the topologies. Combining the first and second step of the methodology yields us the cost estimation of the main components, the costs of the protection system, and the operational costs for each of the topologies. Today we will quickly go over this latter step. The first 2 steps will be discussed in more detail in next week, week 38. For the high wind scenario, the CAPEX and OPEX are shown in this table, where each are first given per each 5-year period, after which their cumulative figure is also shown. It can be seen from these figures that the hub concept has the overall lowest CAPEX, amounting to almost 172 billion euros by 2050. The BOW concept follows with around 186.5 billion euros, after which the national and European concept have cumulatively similar cost, a little over 169 billion euros and 189.5 billion euros respectively. The same order can be seen for OPEX, as these indicators are based on the CAPEX. Combined, the costs for the hub concept are 7% lower than that of the business as usual concept, while the national and European concept are 4 to 8% more expensive. The decrease in costs for the hub concept can be largely attributed to the artificial islands replacing the highly expensive support structures for offshore converters. The increase in cost for the national and European concept can be found in the meshing, including the cable connection costs on the platform and mostly the protection system. This is not offset by the decrease in cable length, which we see in both of the concepts. A similar pattern can be found in the cost figures for the central and low wind scenario, although the differences in costs are not as significant as in the high wind scenario. Even more, the hub concept no longer shows significant savings in the low wind scenario. As the artificial islands in the low wind scenario of the HOP concept are no longer of significant size, it can be concluded here that artificial islands only have a benefit when hosting quite a significant capacity, according to the analysis performed in promotion. How large this capacity exactly is has not been studied within promotion. So what kind of conclusions can we tie to these figures? In all of the meshed concepts, we see that there is an increase in need for DC technologies. These DC technologies drive costs upwards through replacement of AC components. This is especially true in the European and national concept, where there's a need for a DC protection system. The decrease in cable length in these concepts is present, but it's only minimal and therefore does not offset this cost increase. In the hub concept, we see that large hubs replace costs made for DC platforms to quite a large extent. There's a little bit of rerouting of cables, which slightly offsets this cost decrease, but overall it's a quite significant cost decrease. So thank you for your attention. For further questions, please do not hesitate to contact me, and please also tune in to next week's round of presentations.
Hello, I'm Alexandra Armeni from WP7-3, and today I'm going to present you the financing, our financing recommendations for a meshed offshore grid in the North Sea. As I said, WindGuard is a partners of promotion project. We are task leaders of the financing framework for a meshed offshore grid, and today we're going to present you our recommendations. This is our agenda. First, to show the financing challenges, and then go directly to our recommendations. At the end, we will have a wrap-up and conclusions. So within promotion, we had several interviews with a different type of investors and financiers, and the main conclusion is that there is a great interest in the market for investing in a meshed offshore grid. The main barrier is the lack of an adequate legal and regulatory framework for meshed offshore grid investments. Also, some other challenges that we have identified within promotion is, first of all, the huge investment volume. The promotion project has estimated around 170 to 200 billion euros for a 200 gigawatt scenario by 2050. This amount of money, of course, needs both debt and equity funding to be covered. There are some concerns from TSOs, and these are related to long permitting processes, the public acceptance issues, complexity due to different national regulatory frameworks, of course, when it comes to cross-border investments. And some TSOs mentioned the timely adjusted return on equity, so the tariff revenue should allow sufficient cash flow stream, ensuring that the TSOs can maintain their financial ratios and attract investors, of course, whilst continuing to ensure good value for consumers. There's also some concerns from private investors. These are related to the TSO monopoly, the TSO legal ownership restrictions, since very often some state-owned TSOs are not allowed to have private investors in their structures. They also mentioned lack of regulatory clarity, regulatory consistency, or sometimes retroactive actions within a regulatory framework. Also complexity, again, due to the different national regulatory frameworks. And some investors would like to see a more central European grid planning and structure. A last challenge or concern is the interest rates. At the moment, within the current market, long-term stable investments are increasingly attractive propositions to investors against the wider market uncertainty. But if the interest rates increase, the sector will be in greater competition with the alternative investments in the market. So there might be a limited financing potential for the sector, although we don't believe that this will be the case since investments in electricity transmission infrastructure are usually long-term and stable. So what we recommend, first of all, is to establish a long-term, stable, predictable legal and regulatory framework. This is a prerequisite to attract capital from the market by providing investors with long-term visibility and project pipeline, by increasing also investor confidence in remuneration level. So investors need to have confidence that the regulatory regime is stable, and they also need clarity on if and of course how it will adjust to the purpose of the transmission asset change. Also by providing a good balance between incentives and risks, and providing clarity on investors' responsibilities and liabilities, especially for this last a very important point. We recommend that there need to be clarity on how the risks are distributed across actors to enable investors assess the attractiveness of the investment. And for that, we recommend to establish guidelines on liabilities related to the operation and maintenance of the assets, and of course, delays in commissioning or non-availability of the grid. And in the short term, contractual liabilities between offshore wind farm developers and transmission owners could be formed. But in the long term, we recommend to establish an offshore liability regime as part of the regulatory regime for mass offshore grid. This is also the case in some countries like Germany or in the Netherlands. We also recommend a higher coordination of national offshore wind and grid planning, especially to establish robust long-term planning for offshore wind and network development, which will be binding on the countries connected to the mass offshore grid. And it could be a part of a mixed partial agreement between these countries, as it was also recommended by the legal framework within promotion. And this will help to identify, This will help to identify anticipatory investment needs, provide clarity to investors on the pipeline of projects, and thus allow for a better estimation of the investment volumes. In this way, public and private investments could be attracted at lower cost, and international capital could be efficiently allocated. We suggest also to allow remuneration of anticipatory investments in the grid. A mass offshore grid will almost certainly require some form of anticipatory investments, such as oversized converter platforms or islands. The thing is that investors typically do not receive revenue for these oversized assets or not used assets. Also, these cross-border anticipatory grid investments entail higher risk, mainly due to the lack of coordinated grid planning for the North Sea, the regulatory complications, and lack of adequate cost allocation mechanisms among the parties involved. So all of these factors prevent anticipatory investments. So we suggest to follow a coordinated approach to assess the need for and the remuneration for anticipatory investments in order to deliver a cost-efficient and reliable offshore transmission infrastructure. In particular, and here on the right side, you can see our recommendations for the short term to use the EU financial support, for example, the SET funding, to eliminate the risk for investors and bridge the financing gap due to, at least currently, inadequate cost allocation mechanisms. And that way you can unlock the necessary anticipatory investments where the national governments alone cannot deliver. In the long term, we recommend the regulatory remuneration of this kind of investments to strengthen the regulatory framework for investments in offshore transmission, and in order to create the right incentives for investors to take up the investment challenge. We also recommend to support technological innovation and development of offshore transmission assets. Technical developments will be made, of course, as the mass offshore grid develops, and therefore incentive schemes are needed, that can deploy innovative technologies in the grid. For that, we recommend to use EU financial support like SET funding or InnoFin, and more financial programs are going to be launched within 2020 and 2021 in order to reduce the risk profile of the investment and accelerate the technical progress of the industry. Also, we recommend to use price control incentives or competition in the assets design in order to encourage investment innovation. These are practices that are used in some countries, North Seas countries already. And last but not least, we recommend to establish a flexible governance framework and to ensure that this framework for mass offshore grid is flexible enough to allow the use of new technologies that come to the market by reviewing periodically the grid planning and network codes. These are also suggestions and recommendations by the legal framework for a mass offshore grid, developed within promotion also. Last but not least, it needs to be ensured that sufficient capital can be accessed to facilitate massive investments in a mass offshore grid. The financing structures should be considered such that could enable diversified sources of finance to invest in transmission assets, such as broadening the ownership of transmission assets to allow additional finance to be raised whilst reducing the risk for the parent company, or special purpose vehicles for individual transmission projects. The European TSOs and TOs have developed financial strategies in the past, of course, to cope with a capital-intensive transmission investment, and they have managed to attract private investor or securing alternative innovative funding. These strategies could be applied also for a mass offshore grid. For example, and here you can see it on the right side, a TSO substructure where equity partnership, TSO equity partnerships with private or public investors, where the TSO has majority of the voting rights, while the majority of economic interest stays with external investors. Or tenders of transmission assets to third parties with high levels project finance structures. Another option that we have developed within promotion is the one entity, one builder, so to say, for the mass offshore grid, which is responsible for the construction of the grid. And after commissioning of the assets, they transfer the assets to third parties through competitive tenders. This builder or this entity could be seen as a dedicated equity investment fund supported by public and private capital and also the EU. Here, I would like to mention that these models may be combined also to form a range of model options that are suited to the context of the mass offshore grid. So, in conclusion, the main result is that the financing is not for a mass offshore grid, is not a barrier as long as an adequate legal and regulatory framework is in place. Of course, for this, political commitment, collaboration, and higher coordination are needed. EU should support and coordinate the regional initiatives and approaches and ensure that the different national policies are aligned towards a common vision for the North Sea region. And we believe that the set of recommendations and best practices that have been presented by promotion could be the first step to this direction. So that was our main conclusions and recommendations regarding a mass offshore grid from financing perspective. We are looking forward to a Q&A session with you in September. Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome to this promotion breakout session video on legal, regulatory and economic challenges faced while implementing a meshed offshore HVDC grid. I am Pradyumna Bhagwat and I work for the Florence School of Regulation. As part of the Work Package 7, Task 7.2, FSR has been leading the research on the economic frameworks for meshed offshore grids. As part of this study, several economic challenges were analyzed within 3 pillars, namely planning, investment, and operations. In today's presentation, we are going to focus on sharing of costs between different stakeholders while building these transnational meshed grids. More specifically, we will discuss different aspects of the cross-border cost allocation issue. The concept of cross-border cost allocation is included within the EU 10E regulations. These regulations lay down the guidelines for timely development and interoperability of priority corridors and the areas of trans-European energy infrastructure. In the context of the CBCA, the 10E regulations speak about 2 important points. Firstly, the costs borne for developing the trans-European transmission infrastructure should be by the TSO or the project promoters for the member states to which the project provides a net positive impact. Secondly, the sharing of this cost should be determined based on a cost-benefit analysis. Therefore, we can conclude that a beneficiary pays approach based on a CBCA has been indicated. In the context of a meshed offshore grid, a MOG is a multi-stakeholder and a cross-border project, which makes the CBCA an extremely critical element of such a project. From the perspective of this research, as a meshed grid is not yet in existence, we consider existing interconnectors. This can be a first and the most simplest step while developing a meshed offshore grid. Therefore, in this research, we developed a qualitative framework to assess CBCAs for existing interconnectors and apply the knowledge from this assessment to provide insights and recommendations for development of a meshed offshore grid. Based on FSR's previous work on this topic, as well as additional desk research, we developed an assessment framework consisting of 6 criteria. Starting from the top, the first criteria was, is the 10% significance threshold for member states to be considered for cost allocation used to justify the request for CEF funding? Second, whether market tests are conducted to establish commercial viability. Third, whether a complete CBCA decision is provided. In this context, incomplete decisions would mean that the NRAs agree on cost allocation that is based on assigning a part of the cost to the Connecting Europe facility. Then the next, did the CBCA use any innovative approach while allocating costs? A next point was, were impacts of other complementary projects considered? And the sixth and the last point in this framework was, were there any binding commitments to ensure timely development of such a grid included in the CBCA? In the comparative analysis, we used 3 cases for which the CBCA was available publicly, namely the Biscay Gulf, Cobra Cable, and the EVIC. As you can see, there's a lot of scope for improvement that exists, especially in terms of market tests where no market tests were done, binding contracts, and in case of complete CBCA decisions. As all cases had a CEF grant request or a EEPR grant request, we can consider that none of them were complete CBCA decisions. Our analysis also indicated 3 key recommendations for meshed offshore grid, namely from the perspective of considering project interactions, use of significance threshold, and binding commitments. Let's get into more details on these. Firstly, it is recommended to coordinate CBCA decisions between interacting projects, and especially defining complementary projects as a single PCI. This can lead to a faster development of meshed grids as well as a more economically efficient outcome. Secondly, the 10% significant threshold does reduce the complexity in terms of transaction costs of involving small beneficiaries, but it may also be used as a justification for unnecessary funding requests, thus becoming a barrier. Therefore, the interlinkage between significance threshold and the funding request should be revisited. Thirdly, including binding commitments for delivery of projects in the CBCA will aid in mitigating any risks of building bridges to nowhere and of standard investments. Let us recap the key recommendations from this research. First, formalize the CBCA as a binding contract between involved parties with specification of non-compliance penalties. Second, a common CBCA for a group of complementary projects should be considered. And finally, for multi-country projects such as the MOG, the significance threshold can become a barrier in allocating costs and reaching a complete CBCA decision. And then, therefore, it needs to be revisited. Thank you for your attention. For any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me.